I'm going to tell you a story that never made it into the history books. Not because it wasn't significant, it was probably one of the most significant engineering achievements on that particular stretch of Minnesota frontier, but because the person who accomplished it wasn't the right kind of engineer. He didn't have letters after his name. He didn't have credentials from back east. He had something better. An ability to see what everyone else was looking directly at without actually understanding it. And that made him dangerous to the version of the frontier story we all grew up believing. My grandmother, Emma, she used to tell me something that stuck with me my entire life. She'd say, "Clara, the people who laugh at you first are the same ones who'll claim they always believed in you once you're proven right." She said this with the kind of cold, precise anger that only comes from having lived through it. When you grow up hearing stories about ingenious homesteaders and self-made men conquering the wilderness, you're hearing about a very specific kind of ingenuity, the kind that gets documented, celebrated, and recorded. But there was another kind of frontier wisdom, the kind that came from immigrant populations, from people who weren't native English speakers, from anyone whose background didn't match the accepted narrative of American success. That kind of knowledge? That kind got dismissed, stolen, or worst of all, forgotten. I'm telling you this story because I'm tired of that pattern. I'm tired of it on behalf of people like my grandmother, who watched innovations get buried under their boots and then dug back up and claimed by men with authority. This is the story of one of those overlooked moments. A man whose name I'm going to call Niels. Not because that was necessarily his name, but because that's what his neighbors called him. What they said with varying degrees of respect and dismissal, depending on whether they were drunk or sober. Decided to do something that everyone in the settlement told him would kill him. He was going to build a room underground. Not a cellar, mind you. Settlers understood cellars. Cellars were for storing root vegetables and preserved goods in a sealed space beneath the cabin. But a room underground designed to live in? To spend hours and hours down there, breathing air that wasn't recirculating through the cabin's main living space? That wasn't sensible. That was suicide. That was a grave he was digging for himself months in advance. I want to pause here because I can feel my grandmother's presence when I talk about this, and she always gets sharp about one particular thing. Authority to think belongs to the people. Authority to think belongs to the people who've been here longer, the people with English names, the people who learn to move through the world the way the settlement expects. And she's right. That's what the dismissal was really about. Now, here's what they didn't count on, and I'll come back to this phrase because you're going to hear me say it again and again, because it's the truth about frontier settlements. They didn't count on anyone understanding things they didn't understand. They'd arrived with a specific set of assumptions about how the world worked. You kept fires burning to stay warm. You piled blankets on. You packed the gaps in your cabin walls with whatever wouldn't freeze solid. You endured. That was the frontier philosophy. Endure, survive. Do whatever it takes to make it through to spring. The idea that there might be a fundamentally different approach, that maybe the earth itself had properties they hadn't considered, that was too foreign, too strange, too un-American for most of the settlement to take seriously. Niels had grown up in a place where people had been thinking about thermal properties and earth-deep dwelling for centuries. His family came from a region where keeping warm through brutal winters wasn't optional. It was survival, and if you didn't figure it out, your family line ended. That kind of necessity breeds a different kind of thinking. When he came to Minnesota in the 1880s, he arrived with more than just physical skills and a willingness to work himself to exhaustion. He arrived with an accumulated knowledge that had been passed down, tested in practice, proven across generations. The problem was that this knowledge lived in his hands and his instincts, not in written form. He couldn't pull out a document and show it to the skeptics. He could only ask them to watch, And if there's one thing that frontier settlers were exceptional at, it was not watching, not really. They were too busy insisting that they already knew everything. The winter of 1887 was shaping up to be brutal. Even in late September, everyone could feel it. The first frost came 3 weeks earlier than usual. The wind had a different quality to it, a rawness that experienced settlers recognized as a warning sign. That kind of wind doesn't just make your skin hurt, it finds its way into your bones, into the spaces between your ribs where your lungs are trying to work. The taste in the air changes too, becomes sharp and thin, like the cold itself has flavor. The settlement began preparing with the kind of desperate energy that comes from knowing that the next 6 months would determine whether your family survived or didn't. People were calculating wood consumption. Some families had already gone through their entire supply from the previous winter's cutting. They were looking ahead with the specific terror that comes from knowing you'd done all the right things and still might not have enough. Niels watched all of this happening, and he made a decision that the community would discuss for the rest of his life, or at least the people who stayed in the settlement would. He decided that instead of reinforcing the small cabin he'd built, instead of spending his days before the snow came collecting and stacking enough firewood to heat a space that would leak warmth in 100 different directions, he would invest his time and energy into something else entirely. This was, from the settlement's perspective, the kind of decision that announced itself as foolish. Wood was life. Heat was survival. What else could possibly matter? He approached his neighbor, a man I'll call Soren, who'd arrived in the settlement the same year as Niels. Soren was more established, had a larger cabin, had started to gain some acceptance in the community because he was better at performing the acceptable narrative of frontier ambition. But Soren had also worked alongside Niels long enough to understand that Niels thought about problems differently. When Niels approached him on a cold morning in October and explained his plan in low Swedish, Soren listened. This is important, by the way. In the histories of the frontier, we don't often talk about the solidarity that existed within specific immigrant communities, the way that people who shared a common language and background would sometimes trust each other in ways they wouldn't trust the broader settlement. Soren listened to the plan and did something remarkable. He believed it enough to help. And that belief, that's what courage looked like on the frontier. It wasn't reckless. It was a calculated decision to trust knowledge that hadn't been validated by the people in power. The plan itself was relatively simple, at least in conception. Niels had observed that the earth temperature, when you got deep enough, remained remarkably constant through the year. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was stable, 55 degrees year-round beneath the frost line. He'd felt it by digging test holes with nothing but a long rod, pushing down, and feeling the temperature changes as he went deeper. He'd noted where the transition happened, that moment when you went from the frozen upper layers to the stable earth below. He'd sketched drawings in the dirt, showing the insulation value of packed earth, the way that heat wouldn't escape from a space surrounded on all sides by soil that acted as a thermal buffer. His plan was to dig a rectangular chamber about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, 8 feet into the earth. He would reinforce the walls with timber and create an entrance shaft that would allow air circulation, 2 shafts actually, one higher and one lower, which would allow cold air to sink and warm air to rise in a natural convection cycle. The genius of it, if I'm understanding this correctly, was that he wasn't trying to fight the earth. He was working with what the earth already did. The community response was swift and derisive. They laughed. They always laugh, you know? That's the constant in these stories. They laughed and then they explained, at length and with great confidence, why it wouldn't work. The sheriff, whose name was Boone, and he was the kind of man who believed that authority came from being louder and more certain than anyone else, pulled Niels aside one day in the settlement's general store. The store smelled like sawdust and lamp oil, and the particular mustiness of goods stacked in the cold. I can imagine this conversation because I've heard variations of it my entire life, usually with my grandmother's voice in my ear saying, "They always do this. They always think they can talk you out of thinking." "You're making a mistake," Boone said, and his certainty was the kind that comes from complete confidence in one's own ignorance. "You'll be buried alive down there. The air will go bad. You'll suffocate. And when you do, we'll have to come dig you out, and that'll cost this settlement time and money we don't have. You think you're clever, but you're just being a fool. And the rest of us will pay for it." This is the kind of threat that gets wrapped in concern, you understand. Boone wasn't worried about Niels. He was protecting the settlement's narrative about what was possible. Niels, according to Soren's later account, simply nodded and said, "We'll see." He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince Boone. He just said those two words. And he turned back to whatever he'd been doing. That kind of response, the refusal to justify yourself to someone who's already decided you're wrong, that's another form of courage. It's the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. Now, here's what they didn't count on. The phrase again, because it bears repeating. They didn't count on someone proceeding anyway, without consensus, without the blessing of authority, without the community's permission. On the frontier, community approval was supposed to matter. You were supposed to want it, to seek it, to be shaped by it. Independence was a story they told, but conformity was what they enforced. And here came Niels, ready to enforce neither, ready to just get to work. The excavation began in mid-October. Niels and Soren worked together, along with a younger man named Reuben, who was Soren's cousin and had just arrived from Sweden. They worked with nothing but hand tools, shovels with blades hardened in the blacksmith's forge, picks with handles worn smooth by generations of hands, a wheelbarrow that creaked with every load, determination, and the knowledge that they had maybe 6 weeks before the ground would freeze solid enough to make digging nearly impossible. The work was brutal in ways that are difficult to convey to people who've never done it. The Minnesota earth, especially as you go deeper, is dense and compacted. It's not sand that moves easily. It's clay and stone and compressed soil that's been settling for millennia. Every cubic foot of dirt they removed had to be broken free, loaded into a shovel, a movement that required both hands and back working against gravity, hauled to the surface in that wheelbarrow, and spread around the site. Their hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Then those calluses blistered and bled. Then new skin formed and hardened again. Soren reported that there were days when even he, experienced from years of hard labor, could barely grip his shovel by day's end. His palms were raw. His back was screaming. His legs felt like someone had drained all the blood out of them and replaced it with lead. And here's the thing that my grandmother made sure I understood. That kind of physical effort, that kind of pain, that was being done without applause. There was no settlement coming together to celebrate the work. There was no community investment. It was 3 men, then 4, then 5, doing the hardest work they'd do all year, with no guarantee that it would matter, no safety net if it failed, no authority validating that it was worth the cost. But something interesting happened during those weeks of excavation. The skepticism didn't turn into belief. Not yet, not among the community at large. But it did develop a different texture. As more people watched the pit getting deeper and deeper, as the mathematical reality of the excavation became undeniable, the laughter shifted. It became less certain. They started to wonder, not because they'd changed their minds, but because doubt had been introduced into their certainty. You can only mock something for so long when you're watching it actually happen in front of you. Eventually, the question changes from, Will he do this to what happens when he does? The blacksmith, a man named Jorgen, who was influential in the settlement because he provided services everyone needed, started asking questions. Not friendly questions, mind you, the kind of sharp, challenging questions that come from someone who resents being proven wrong by someone he considers beneath him. Jorgen's blacksmith shop was the center of the settlement's technology. He was the one who kept tools working, who shoed horses, who was consulted on engineering matters because he understood metal and heat and structural integrity. Niels's success would be an implicit criticism of Jorgen's judgment. "How's the drainage?" Jorgen demanded one day, standing at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed, his body language announcing that he was still skeptical, still superior. But now he had to ask. "Good," Niels replied, sloping toward the east. "Water runs away." "And the walls won't collapse?" "You've got weight on top. You've got frost heave. Minnesota soil moves when it freezes." "They're stable. I've checked every day. The angle is right. The earth holds itself." This was true. Niels had an eye for soil mechanics that was probably the product of generations of accumulated knowledge, even if he couldn't have explained it in the theoretical terms that would have made it acceptable to men like Jorgen. The walls of the pit were sloped correctly, angled at the precise degree where the packed earth would support itself without requiring reinforcement until the final interior walls were installed. This wasn't luck. This was knowledge that had been tested against real winters across multiple generations. This was the opposite of guessing. By late October, the pit was complete. What emerged was a nearly perfect rectangle, 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, with stable walls and a floor that was already showing the cool, damp quality of earth well below the frost line. The temperature down there was noticeably different even as you descended. You could feel it on your face, the way the air shifted from cold to cooler to a deep, steady coolness that wasn't biting anymore. The smell changed too, less like the sharp, dry, cold air above, and more like earth itself, minerals and moisture, and the density of depth. Then came the engineering work that nobody expected, the installation of the timber framework. This is where Niels's knowledge became impossible to dismiss, because the work had to be seen to be believed. He'd commissioned timber from the mill, carefully selected pieces, all of them treated with a specific technique to resist rot and moisture that Soren explained was something Swedish, which in the context of the settlement's xenophobia was almost a slur, but also an acknowledgement that the technique worked. The framework he constructed was brilliant in its simplicity. He created a double wall system, using the excavated pit as his outer walls, and installing a timber framework inside that left about a 2-foot air gap between the outer earth wall and the inner timber wall. This gap, he explained patiently to anyone who asked, would allow water and cold air to flow down and away without compromising the structural integrity or the living space. Water, he said, will always try to find the lowest point. Let it find its lowest point in the space between walls, not in the space where you're trying to live. The entrance was equally ingenious. He created a sloped entry shaft that descended at a gentle angle with 2 separate air shafts, one at the top of the underground room and one at the bottom, positioned so that air would circulate naturally. Cold air would enter through the lower shaft, and warm air would exit through the upper shaft, creating a convection cycle that would keep the air fresh without requiring any mechanical means. In an era before anyone was thinking seriously about HVAC systems, before the word ventilation had been standardized in building practice, he was creating principles that modern engineers would recognize and validate. This was applied physics. This was the kind of thinking that should have earned him respect, but instead, it earned him suspicion because he couldn't explain it in the language of authority. My grandmother, when she told me this story, always paused here to say something fierce. She'd say, "Clara, remember that the men who mocked him were the same ones who'd spent their whole lives fighting against the natural world. They thought that mastery came from domination. He understood that mastery comes from cooperation, and that difference meant everything." The work continued through early November. Soren and Ruben had been joined by two other men, Ostrom, another Swedish immigrant, and surprisingly, a man named Webb, who was American-born but had listened to enough criticism of Niels's plan to become curious about what the actual design entailed. When Webb saw the engineering, something changed. Not his public opinion. He was still too embedded in the community's skepticism to risk changing his stance too quickly. But his private understanding shifted. He began asking technical questions instead of dismissive ones. How deep is the lower air shaft? What diameter did you use for the upper ventilation? When the frost heaves in spring, won't the entire structure shift? These were real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity and the beginning of genuine respect. By the time the first snow fell in mid-November, the underground room was structurally complete. The walls were finished, the air shafts were functional, and Niels had created a simple interior with a sleeping platform, a work area, and space for hanging clothes and supplies. The temperature inside, when they checked it, was already running around 50 degrees, and he hadn't even sealed the entrance yet or completed the final touches. People who descended the sloped shaft would emerge into a space that felt fundamentally different from the world above. The cold air you were expecting didn't materialize. The damp that you anticipated wasn't threatening. Instead, there was this steady, almost pleasant coolness. Your breath still made a small fog, but it dissipated quickly. Your fingers didn't start going numb within minutes. It was like stepping out of winter and into something other. This is when things became interesting, because the settlement couldn't ignore it anymore. The physical reality of the space existed. A man had successfully created an underground dwelling. It was finished before winter, and it looked intentional and well-constructed rather than like a desperate grave dig. The sheriff, Boone, made an official visit to inspect it, supposedly to ensure that Niels wasn't creating a public health hazard, but really because the settlement's narrative was starting to crack, and someone in authority needed to attempt to restore it. Boone climbed down into that shaft with visible reluctance, his body language announcing that this was still foolish, still suspicious, still probably dangerous in ways he hadn't anticipated. What Boone found underground, and he described this later, reluctantly, to several people who pressed him for information, was something that didn't fit his expectations. The space was clean. The air didn't smell stale or dangerous. It smelled like earth and wood, and the specific freshness that comes from air that's actually circulating properly. The temperature was mild. Niels was sitting at a work table with a lamp. A simple lamp, nothing fancy, just providing light to the underground space, writing something on paper. And he looked entirely at ease in an environment that was supposedly uninhabitable. He wasn't huddled. He wasn't cold. He wasn't gasping for breath or showing any sign of distress. He looked like a man sitting at a table. Boone stood in the underground room for maybe 5 minutes, uncomfortable, and struggling to find something to criticize. He checked the walls. He looked at the timber framing. He examined the air shafts. He looked at the entrance. He was searching for something wrong, something that would validate his original skepticism, and he couldn't find it. He then climbed back up to the surface without saying much of anything. What happened next was important, and it's one of the reasons this story matters. The settlement didn't announce the success. There wasn't a declaration that the doubts had been wrong. Instead, there was a kind of collective silence, a waiting to see what would happen. Would Niels actually live down there through the full winter? Would he survive? Or would he eventually admit that it was a failed experiment and climb back to ground level like a sensible person? Or, and this was the question nobody wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking, what would happen if Niels survived better than they did? The first week of December arrived with a hard freeze. Temperatures dropped to 10, 15, 20 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that makes your eyelashes freeze together if you're not careful. The kind of cold that turns exposed skin numb in minutes. The settlement's cabins began showing signs of the strain. Firewood consumption accelerated. The cold was the kind that seemed to have intention, like it was actively trying to get inside and kill you. People woke in the morning to find frost accumulations on the inside of their cabin walls, despite having fires burning all night. Not just a rime of frost, thick ice, an inch thick sometimes, coating the entire interior surface. The animals huddled in shared body heat in barns, their breath creating small clouds of warmth in the brutal cold. The world became a study in how to survive an environment actively hostile to human life. And in that context of desperation, in that moment when everyone was suffering and burning through resources and wondering if they'd have enough to make it to spring, Niels descended into his underground room. This is the moment where the story shifts, where Clara's voice needs to carry the weight of what this meant. I'm going to tell you what I understand to be the truth of what happened, knowing full well that I'm not there to see it with my own eyes, but having heard enough frontier stories to recognize the shape of it. The man descended into the earth, sealed the entrance shaft behind him as well as he could without completely cutting off air circulation, and created a space where he could live through the winter with a level of comfort that nobody in the settlement could match. And I want to be clear about what this meant. Above ground, people were suffering. Above ground, people were burning through firewood at an unsustainable rate, and they knew it. And they were terrified about what would happen when the wood ran out. Above ground, people were staying awake at night, listening to the wind and the sound of their cabins creaking under the weight of snow and the stress of cold. And below ground, there was a man sitting at a table, his fingers not numb, his breath not frosting, his life not in constant danger. The first test came in the third week of December. A traveler passed through the settlement on his way from one town to another, someone without local attachment, without the investment in being right or wrong about Niels' experiment. His name was Marcus, or so the record suggests, though by this point in frontier history the names of travelers were often lost or misremembered. He arrived at the settlement's main building in the early morning, half frozen and angry about the cold. His horse was nearly done. His supplies were running low. He'd been exposed to the elements for 3 days straight, and his body was showing the signs of it. His movements were slow. His judgment was probably compromised by the cold. His desperation was visible. The minister, whose name was Peterson, took pity on him and offered him shelter, but before he did, someone mentioned the underground room. Word had gotten around, as it always does, and the traveler, out of pure curiosity mixed with the skepticism of someone who'd survived multiple frontier winters, asked to see it. Niels, who apparently understood the value of demonstration, invited the man down. The traveler descended into the underground space and found what Niels had been living in for 3 weeks, a consistently cool but not cold environment, clean air that actually felt fresh, a dry floor, a system that worked. The traveler's initial skepticism gave way to something like wonder. He sat inside for an hour, warming up, eating a meal that Niels offered him, simple food, nothing fancy, but served in a space that was genuinely comfortable. They talked. Niels showed him the air shafts, explained the principle of the double walls, demonstrated how the thermometer showed the temperature maintaining itself. When the traveler climbed back up to the surface, his entire perspective had shifted. He went immediately to the minister and said something that would begin to shift the settlement's narrative, albeit slowly and with great resistance. "That man has built something remarkable," the traveler said. "I've survived 20 Minnesota winters. I've been frozen nearly to death. I've seen men die from the cold, and I've never seen an underground dwelling with air this fresh and temperature this stable. Whatever engineering he's used, it's working, and it's working better than any cabin I've ever seen." He paused, and then he said something that was important. "That man knows something the rest of us don't, and he's willing to show it to anyone who bothers to pay attention." Now, here's what they didn't count on: the fact that validation from an outsider, from someone with no stake in the settlement's internal politics, could shift perception. Not immediately, not universally, but enough to crack the certainty that had dominated the conversation. The minister began to think differently about Niels. The sheriff's inspection, which had previously been a source of skepticism, now became ammunition for those who wanted to admit that something was working. People who'd been dismissive started asking careful questions. They weren't admitting they'd been wrong exactly. Instead, they were positioning themselves as the ones who'd always known this could work. They'd just been cautious. They just wanted to wait for proof. This is the pattern my grandmother warned me about: how quickly people rewrite their own complicity. By January, people were asking. The town clerk, a man named Whitfield, who kept careful records of everything, with the kind of obsessive precision that comes from understanding that documentation is power, began keeping a log of temperatures inside and outside Niels's underground room. This was crucial, not because Niels needed validation, he already knew it was working, but because the community needed the data, the written record, the numbers that couldn't be dismissed as anecdote or misperception. Whitfield would descend into the underground space twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, bundled in layers, carrying a thermometer he'd brought from the east. A fine instrument, expensive, accurate to 1/10 of a degree. He would record the temperature in the underground room with precise handwriting. He recorded the outside temperature. He recorded the weather conditions, wind direction, precipitation, the quality of the cold. He was creating, without perhaps fully understanding what he was doing, a data set that would prove the principle. 2 columns of numbers: above ground, below ground. The difference speaking for itself. By mid-January, the data was undeniable. The underground room maintained a temperature between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the outside temperature. When it was 20 below zero at the surface, the thermometer descending into that shaft would read 54 degrees. When it was 30 below, it still read 54 degrees. When it was 40 below, and Minnesota had days like that, days when the air itself felt dangerous, when the cold seemed to have a malevolent presence, the underground room still maintained its perfect 54 degrees. The thermometer and the notebook and Whitfield's careful handwriting created a truth that the settlement couldn't argue with. The blacksmith, Jorgen, came down to see the data himself, examining Whitfield's notebook with the eye of someone who understood precision. The sheriff, Boone, asked to review Whitfield's measurements, running his finger down the columns of numbers as if the numbers themselves might confess something different if he looked at them long enough. The minister began talking about it in his weekly sermons, framing it as evidence of God's design in the natural world, which was a way of beginning to accept the reality without fully admitting that he'd been wrong about it. "The Lord," Peterson said, "has hidden wisdom in the earth itself. Those who learn to read his creation with humility and patience may discover truths that confound the proud." What nobody said, but everyone understood, was that Niels had been living more comfortably through the winter than any of them. His heating requirements were minimal, his air was fresh, his space was stable, his hands weren't numb. His children, for Niels had a daughter by this time, weren't getting sick from constant cold exposure. He had succeeded at something they'd all claimed was impossible, and the only way they could accept this success was to begin reimagining its significance. In February, when the worst of the winter was still in effect, the kind of February where you stop believing spring exists, where the cold has become the permanent state of the world, the blacksmith's teenage son fell ill. A fever, probably influenza, the kind of sickness that killed during frontier winters because the body was already stressed from constant cold and inadequate nutrition. The immune system, hammered by months of exposure, couldn't fight back. The boy's name was Eric, and he was perhaps 14 years old, tall for his age, with the kind of promise that made his illness particularly terrifying. The minister, in a gesture that was part spiritual concern and part political calculation, asked Niels whether the boy might spend a few days recovering in the underground room, where the consistent temperature and clean air might help him. This was a profound admission. This was Boone and Jorgen and the settlement collectively admitting that Niels's space was superior to theirs. This was asking him for help. Niels said yes without hesitation. No conditions, no demands for payment or recognition. He said yes, and he prepared a space for the boy, and he made sure the area was clean and ready. This is the kind of grace that doesn't announce itself. It's just action. Eric descended into the underground room with his mother, and the minister attended to him, and Niels provided food and warmth and the basic care that you'd offer to anyone suffering. The boy spent 4 days below ground while his mother and the minister attended to him. Slowly, the fever broke. His color improved. His breathing became easier. The constant shaking stopped. When he emerged, he was recovering. The illness had run its course in a space that allowed his body to heal instead of fighting for survival. His mother wept and thanked Niels, and she didn't hide this gratitude. She spoke about it openly in the settlement, about how her son had been saved by the warmth and the clean air and the stable environment. This was the moment where the narrative began to shift decisively, because now it wasn't abstract principle anymore. Now it was a specific human benefit, a child's life, a mother's gratitude, a visible, undeniable good. And you can't dismiss something that saved your child's life. You can try, but you'll be living a lie. And frontier communities were good at many things, but living with obvious lies was harder than just accepting what happened. By the end of March, when the thaw began and the snow started to recede, revealing the damaged and stressed landscape beneath, the settlement's assessment of Niels's underground room had transformed completely. It wasn't something to be mocked anymore. It was something to be explained, studied, and most importantly, emulated. The blacksmith, the same blacksmith who demanded proof and asked challenging questions, started talking about building his own underground room for next winter. Webb began sketching designs based on Niels's model, working from memory and observation, trying to understand the principles that underlay the structure. Other families approached Niels with requests. Could you help us build one? Do you think this would work on our land? What tools did you use? Even the sheriff Boone seemed to be taking notes, though he'd never admit it publicly. His authority had been directly challenged by Niels's success, and now he had to figure out how to integrate that challenge into his understanding of how the settlement worked. But here's where the story takes a turn that I think about a lot because it connects to my grandmother's warning about people claiming they always believed in you. As spring arrived and the crisis of winter faded into memory, the settlement began to tell a different story. They began to claim that they'd understood Niels's design all along, that they'd just wanted to be cautious. That, of course, intelligent people would recognize the value of an underground room once they'd thought about it. The courage it had taken Niels to proceed without permission, without validation, without certainty, that became downplayed. The innovation became a thing that was obvious once you thought about it, which is a kind way of saying they were trying to erase the moment when they'd been wrong. Boone, in particular, was skilled at this rhetorical maneuver. He began saying things like, "Well, I recognized the potential early on. I just needed to see the data to be sure." He positioned himself as a cautious evaluator of new ideas rather than a skeptic who'd been proven wrong. And this is what made my grandmother angry. This rewriting of history, this retroactive claim to wisdom they didn't possess. Prove yourself right. And then they prove yourself right. And then they pretend they always believed you. What you've actually done is proven that the crowd's rejection doesn't mean anything. And that's dangerous to people in power. So they erase the rejection. They make it seem like it never happened. And then the next person with an unconventional idea looks at that story and thinks, well, maybe I should wait for permission. And the innovation slows to a crawl. By the summer of 1888, 3 other underground rooms were being constructed by families in the settlement. The design was Niels's. The principles were his. The willingness to take the risk was his. The work involved digging into the earth again and again, hand tools breaking through soil, timber frameworks being constructed with precise angles, air shafts being positioned for optimal circulation. People were learning from Niels how to do the work, but by late that summer, it was being discussed as something the settlement had figured out together, as if collective wisdom had gradually arrived at this solution, rather than one man having known it and demonstrated it while everyone else laughed. Niels didn't fight this narrative. According to Soren, he seemed almost relieved that the fighting part was over, that he could now spend his time helping other families build their own underground rooms, rather than defending his design. He worked with Webb and the blacksmith and several others, sharing his knowledge freely, answering their questions with patience. "Why is the lower air shaft at that angle?" Webb would ask. "Because cold air wants to settle, and you want to help it find the path of least resistance," Niels would explain. "And the upper shaft?" "Warm air rises. You just create the path and let the air do what it naturally wants to do." He was teaching them not just how to build, but how to think about the problems, how to work with natural forces instead of against them. This was knowledge that went far deeper than just the specific structure of the room. This was engineering philosophy, handed over freely to people who'd mocked him. He was being gracious in a way that the settlement probably didn't deserve, but that might have been the only way to survive, to let them rewrite the history as long as the knowledge was spreading. My grandmother, Emma, she told me something once that I think applies here. You take the win, however much credit they give you. You're not a winner. You're a loser. 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 you're a loser, 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 you take the win, however much credit they give you, because at least the knowledge survives. She said this with the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from being a woman who'd been dismissed plenty of times and learned to pick her battles. The underground room was real, she said. That was the important part. Who got to claim the credit? That was just noise. But even as she said that, I could see in her face that it wasn't just noise, that it hurt. That watching someone take your knowledge and claim it as their own wisdom was a specific kind of injury. But you survived it. You endured it. And you kept building. By the time winter came again in 1888, the settlement had changed in a fundamental way. The underground rooms weren't just engineering achievements. They were solving a real problem that the frontier cabin design couldn't solve. The constant heating, the fuel consumption, the physical toll of winter on the human body, all of it was reduced dramatically in these cool, stable spaces. Families used them as living quarters during the worst cold snaps, as sleeping quarters when the surface cabins became unbearably cold, as refugees where elderly people and young children could recover from illness without being exposed to the constant thermal stress. The survival rate improved. Fewer people got sick. Children suffered less from the constant cold exposure, and because more people survived, the settlement began to grow. Resources weren't being consumed as desperately. Time that had been spent just trying to stay warm could now be invested in other work. What's remarkable about this is that Niels's innovation spread throughout the frontier. As settlers moved west, they carried the knowledge with them. People who'd never met Niels, who were in places he'd never been, in territories far from Minnesota, built underground rooms based on principles they'd learned secondhand. The knowledge spread through networks of settlers, through immigrant communities sharing information, through practical demonstration by people like Niels who'd learned the technique and then moved on. The innovation became common enough that it eventually got incorporated into frontier building practices without anyone necessarily knowing where it came from. Historians would later, in their objective way, note that underground rooms became more prevalent during the 1890s as settlement patterns in Minnesota spread northward, which is technically accurate and completely misses the point. The historians were recording the fact without understanding the human knowledge, the courage, the rejection, and eventual vindication that had created that fact. The point is that a man who didn't speak English as a native language, who didn't have formal credentials, who didn't fit the settlement's idea of authority, had solved one of the frontier's most pressing problems. He'd done it through observation and inherited knowledge and willingness to act without validation. And then the settlement had collectively rewritten the story to make it seem inevitable rather than courageous, collaborative rather than solitary, conventional rather than revolutionary. This is what happens to unconventional knowledge on the frontier. It gets absorbed and anonymized. This is why I'm telling you this story on Clara's channel. This is why my grandmother's voice is in my head as I speak. Because there are thousands of stories like this in the frontier records, stories about people whose innovations were dismissed, whose knowledge was doubted, whose courage was unacknowledged, and who were eventually written out of their own accomplishments. They're not usually the stories that make it into the textbooks. They're not the stories that inspire the Hollywood narratives about frontier genius. They're the stories that get left in the margins, mentioned in passing, acknowledged without understanding their actual significance. And I'm tired of them being left in the margins. I'm tired of it on behalf of everyone who'd ever had an idea that didn't fit the accepted narrative. Anyone who'd been dismissed for thinking differently. Anyone who'd been proven right and then had their rightness claimed by people who'd mocked them. Niels lived in that settlement for another 30 years. He built underground rooms, helped other people construct them, gradually earned a kind of respect that came more from competence becoming undeniable than from the community actually changing its fundamental attitudes about who got to be an innovator. He trained Soren's son in the craft. He passed the knowledge on to anyone willing to learn. He saw the principle become common enough that it wasn't remarkable anymore, which was probably a kind of success, even if it wasn't the kind of recognition that feels good. By the time he was in his 60s, the underground rooms he'd designed and built were just part of the landscape. No one asked about them anymore. They were just there, proven by decades of successful operation, accepted as normal frontier architecture. When my grandmother talked about people like Niels, she always returned to the same observation. The smart ones don't care about being right. They care about the thing being right. Emma had seen this pattern her entire life. Women's ideas attributed to men, immigrant contributions credited to more established families, unconventional solutions dismissed until they became conventional enough that people forgot they'd ever been controversial. She'd watched these patterns repeat through her own life, and she'd learned to protect what mattered: the knowledge, the solution, the thing itself, and let the credit go where it went. The legacy of that underground room in Minnesota is that it proved that the frontier's conventional wisdom wasn't actually wisdom. It was just convention. And that distinction matters. Convention can be questioned. Convention can be overturned by evidence. But it takes someone brave enough to be willing to be dismissed in the process of proving it wrong. It takes someone willing to lose the approval of the community while building something that will eventually prove them right. It takes the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself loudly, that just keeps digging, that keeps working, that keeps moving forward even when everyone's telling you that you're foolish. Now, I'm going to end this the way my grandmother always ended conversations like this, before anyone decided it mattered, that he'd been the one to figure it out. She'd pause here, and her eyes would get that hard, clear look that meant she was about to say something important. The real innovation isn't usually the thing itself. It's the courage to do something everyone says won't work, and then the grace to let them claim credit while you move on to the next problem that needs solving. That's the frontier skill nobody talks about. That's the engineering that matters. Not just understanding how to make the room work, but understanding how to survive the human reaction to you being right when they were wrong. The underground room survived winters that would have destroyed conventional cabins. It provided fresh air in an environment where everyone else was suffocating on recirculated, cold, damaged air. It proved that thermal stability was possible through understanding geology rather than fighting against it. It demonstrated that working with natural systems was more efficient than fighting against them, and it did all of this because one man was willing to be dismissed in the eyes of his community so that he could be right in the face of the earth itself. Because one man understood that the approval of authority was less important than the function of the thing being built. Because one man had knowledge that came from a different place, spoken in a different language, validated by a different culture, and he was brave enough to trust it. That's the story. That's the knowledge that survived. That's the reason I'm telling it to you now, with my grandmother's voice in my ear, insisting that the overlooked stories matter just as much as the celebrated ones, maybe more. Overlooked ones. They only survive if overlooked ones. They only survive if someone chooses to remember them. They only survive if someone's willing to get angry on behalf of the people who were dismissed. They only survive if we decide that the frontier story isn't just about the people who got celebrated, but about the knowledge, the courage, and the innovation that happened in the margins, that happened without permission, that happened because someone understood something the crowd didn't understand yet.